Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
And welcome to another episode of Autobiography of a Yogi, line by line. We are on chapter 7, part 3, from the lines, "Those letters come from far off America." And we're going to go all the way down to the end of the song. And with me today, we have the whole team, Priyank, Mike, and Chris joining us.
Reunited.
Reunited once more. What a joy. Yeah, let's delve right on in. So we've just had, a conversation between the two, the saint and Mukunda, and then the saint points to several thick envelopes on a table, and he says that those letters have come from far off America. And he says that he's been corresponding with a few societies who are interested in yoga, which is really, really interesting. Not only that he's talking with America about yoga, but the fact that these envelopes are so thick, kind of, to me, it's interesting because it's not just like a one or two lines. It seems like a full-on conversation potentially. What do you think, Priyank?
We presume he's talking about North America, of course. But do you think it's English that he's the letters, correspondence, and because if it is English, then that would then mean that he is fluent in at least reading English, if not reading, writing, and speaking. What do you think?
That's a good point. I think yes. It would seem unlikely that Americans may speak Bengali, but who knows? What do you think, Mike?
Must be right. Like even now in America, barely anyone speaks any other languages than English. So I would be surprised. And then English in India was always like, in that time, probably still pretty widespread. And I also think that's pretty incredible that they had a connection. Like this was like the early 1900s, right? So that he found someone at this time already in India that he could in America who could correspond with about yoga was incredible.
Exactly, yeah. And he also says that they're discovering India anew. I love this bit. It feels such like a little joke. He says, with a better sense of direction than Columbus. And to be honest, I didn't get the comedy until I read it at least 3 or 4 times, and then I was finally like, that's actually really, really hilarious. Priyank.
Yeah, because Columbus was famously looking for India, if I recall, and he thought it was India, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
Chris is air quoting. What do you mean?
Oh, there's a whole story to that where to get the funding, you had to say that he was going to India, but I think he already knew that there was land out elsewhere.
Interesting.
Something
interesting.
like that.
Very interesting.
You love a good conspiracy, don't you, Chris?
Yeah, I'm all about that.
Even historical one,
Especially
from
the true
200 or
ones.
300 years ago, yeah.
Especially true.
I find it interesting that it changes the perspective on the whole Columbus story, right? Because usually you see it from the perspective of Europe, that he wanted to find India, they found America. But imagine from the perspective of India, they wanted to find us, but they found something else instead. It's I find it's really funny, and he probably a bit tongue in cheek the way he says it there. So it's like they try to find us and look at them.
Look at them now. That he mentions he corresponds with a few societies who are interested in yoga. I did a bit of research. And I think the societies he could be referring to are the Theosophical Society, which was pretty big back then. That may have, I think, had one of their big groups in New York City, and Madame Blavatsky being the founder and the most famous member of that society, who was obviously had very strong links with India and mysticism, and which obviously is still pretty important in terms of the influence of Hinduism on the West, I suppose. And also I thought, because Emerson was such a avid Hindu, scripture researcher, I think he had a group called the Transcendental Club that he founded, and that one, there could have been offshoots, because that would have been before this time, but there could have been offshoots that came out of that after Emerson passed, and some of those societies that were influenced by that could have been the ones that he could be referring to. But if anyone knows what other ones were prominent, please do comment. We'd be interested to know.
That would be really interesting to find out, wouldn't it? Yeah. And it's also interesting because afterwards he says that he's glad to help them. So it kind of indicates that he is sharing knowledge with them, sharing about, he's not just chatting with them, it's actually, a helpful exchange. And then he goes on to say, a knowledge of yoga, like the daylight, is free to all who will receive it. It's amazing. Something I wondered is, do you guys think when he says a knowledge of yoga, do you think that means a theoretical understanding, knowledge, or do you think it means like a deeper knowing?
I think both, and I also think back in the, like, how people are when they know nothing, they make up stuff, right? And I feel like that's what the prevalent thing was at this point. You thought of yogis and you probably saw weird images of fakirs and whatnot, right? And instead of getting what it's really all about. And so he was probably his firsthand, to the people who were interested in America, his firsthand experience was probably great for them, and it was maybe satisfying for him to clarify the picture of yoga.
Yeah, it's also amazing, isn't it, how timeless the interest in yoga is throughout time, throughout the ages. Even back then, people were still interested in it, and it seems, it's growing and growing, isn't it? Yeah, what do you think, Chris?
We talked about in the last episode about how things age well, like truth ages well. It's just along the same lines, isn't it? Like a knowledge of yoga is like the daylight; it's free to all who receive. And this little passage reminds me when you're at school, 20 plus years ago, and you had pen friends, and you're writing to the pen friends, what's your life like? I do this, and I live like, and here's what I play with my toys and things, and you're having these innocent conversations. But now today we live in the information age, and transformation of information is instantaneous, around the world, and it's just exponentially more intense, isn't it? And so this is even more true today than it was even back then, 100 years ago. You had to wait a long time, and sort of time is money in a sense. Like you had to wait time, you had to write, and it was this arduous process. Where today, the information of truth and yoga is essentially free. It's there for anybody to have. So it's never been more true than it is today. So again, this statement it stands the test of time.
I looked up the Google Books Ngram for the word yoga, and around 1860 there's a spike. May or may not be a coincidence, but he would have probably started communicating with his far off friends in those societies at that time.
Isn't it amazing? All these little, well, they're not little, but all these moments throughout history, they really make today. We would not be sitting here if it weren't for all of these happenings. Anyway, I digress. That's another topic. And then he goes on to say, and I'm going to have to read this verbatim because I feel like a lot of what he says can't really put it in your own words. So he says, what rishis perceived as essential for human salvation need not be diluted for the West. Alike in soul, though diverse in outer experience, neither West nor East will flourish if some form of disciplinary yoga be not practiced. So much to unpick here. Go on, Mike.
I think one thing he speaks to there is that belief. I think they mentioned it in the Awake movie, right? That there was a belief that yoga is only Indians are fit to do yoga, and for Westerners it actually has bad effects, and that is kind of a point he wants to make, that this is like a universal teaching that works for everybody, and it's not just a thing for Indians, and also that the truth, like what Chris earlier said, like the truth is the truth, right? That you don't change it. There's no truth for the West and the truth for the East, right? There's one truth.
Oh, are you saying that yoga is for Westerners? I thought this was true.
What?
I kid, of course. I'm a Westerner.
You know, I think the general resistance, just to kind of throw my 2 cents in there, is the tradition of religion. It's sort of this, you know, rebuke against, oh, that's some sort of religion that the East, the world of the East, you know, India has, whereas that's a misunderstanding of it, isn't it? It's a misconception of what it truly is. So because of the religious dogma in the West, then it automatically wants to reject anything that they think it's going to challenge it, because it will ultimately sort of challenge it. I think that's probably more the roots as to why it had to be sort of diluted initially, to try to sort of ease its way into the consciousness, because it's so hardened.
Chris, it says what rishis perceived as essential for human salvation. What do you think they're referring to?
Classic Priyank hospital pass.
Yeah. Yeah. Give me a minute. Yeah.
Put you on the spot
perceived as
there.
essential.
Don't Google stuff.
I think the ultimate one, the only thing really that keeps coming to mind is the pursuit for not happiness but God. And the Western civilization, in the US, is based on the pursuit of happiness, which is kind of this, I don't know, it's been sort of diluted into the sense, pursuit of pleasures and material wealth, but it's this what the East is grounded in, India is grounded in, which is, seeking God first. To me, that's the essential, the route to God, the path to God. Does that answer it?
Isn't that true for Christianity and the other?
Yeah, but it doesn't. We talked about it, in the last episode, that the guru's given us the path to God. Yoga gives us the path to God. It's more the mechanical, step-by-step, scientific approach versus the prayer approach, which is more what Christianity's
the devotion
faith and devotion, which is we talked about it again last episode, actually, didn't we? Like, it's essential in the path, and you cannot do the mechanical techniques and meditative techniques without the devotion. So it's the combination of the two. But certainly I think the mechanical step-by-step method is missing in Christianity.
Well, unless you read in between the lines, as Guruji does, for example,
unless you've got that divine perception, which
in the second coming of Christ, for example, the seven churches he talks about and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got that level of perception, you're
7 candlesticks, 7 churches. Amazing. I mean, the way I see it, he was probably a God-realized master. So whatever he told them was probably full of wisdom. I wonder what his emphasis was on, though, right? Like, was he? I don't think he taught anyone Kriya Yoga, as far as I know. Maybe he did. He was really big on Hatha Yoga, right? That was like one of the things that he cared about, and that what he taught the students at the school where he was at. So maybe he was trying to promote that in the West, or something more mythical like the Bhagavad Gita. I don't know.
Do you think these ancient rishis that he's talking about, is one of them, could it be Patanjali, maybe, Chris?
You like Patanjali? Yeah, you often like a pop quiz on Patanjali's.
Big fan.
Yeah. What do you think, Brad?
I was giving you an open goal. There's like a million things you could talk about. You could talk about fasting that Lauren
I just
and
shot
I are
straight
doing,
down
for
the middle
example,
of the net. You might have a more finesse. Your approach.
We've covered it. I would have started with Patanjali's eightfold yoga path, which obviously Kriya is part of, but everything from lifestyle to devotion, as you mentioned, and the method, the airplane route that we have, is not new to this age. It's been there for ages before, and so much so that there was literal physical descriptions of flying aircraft, vimanas, in ancient Indian scripts.
And there is that unity, isn't there, between all of or many of the historical texts from these great knowers of truth. And when you read them all, you see that they have this unity of truth and what we need to do to sort of save ourselves from delusion, so to speak.
Yeah. So next time, Chris, I'm going to give you this kind of hospital pass again, and you should just say Patanjali and just say the eightfold path. Name it. I think this is probably the third time I've put you on the spot with this one.
Probably more fourth, I think, at least. Yeah, I did study it for the last episode, just in case you.
I have to say, though, I'm actually very touched by this line. The reason being is because it would be so easy to assume that, you're taking a very deep way of living of truth, and we're taking it to people who potentially have not been exposed to this before, and there could be a tendency to dilute it, to make it different. And we know this from our guru in beyond words for me, but he gave us the distilled essence. He didn't dilute anything, except that the only thing he did to me was that he made it accessible, and he altered the approach to his audience. And yeah, it's very touching.
Certainly not diluted, but Babaji gave a special dispensation through Lahiri Mahashaya, isn't it? And Mataji, because Lahiri Mahashaya asked him essentially that Kriya should be given freely. We shouldn't just be for rishis that are in the Himalayas and or doing all this tapas or austere path of that rishis take, but for everyone, including householders. And then Babaji allowed the prescriptions or the requirements to be made for everyday man, as opposed to the ones that are that committed.
I think that's a good point that Lauren made about how universal the languages that Yogananda uses. You see that, for example, when you see how many countries have followers of Yogananda, almost every country, right? And almost everyone feels like it was made for them, right? So it's not too much of a certain kind. It seems to be written in exactly the right balance for almost everyone in the world to kind of read that and think, oh yeah, I can relate to that.
So why, Mike, has SRF got such a low following compared to the worldwide population and other religions?
I mean, I'm not gonna comment that even. I don't think it's that low. I think it is what it is in our age, right? And I think Guruji always went for people who actually seek rather than trying to be popular among the masses. And I mean, he's a God-realized master. Who am I to even say anything about this? I think that's the right way to go.
Nice. That's so true. That's so true. Because only very few people seek the truth. That was one of the talks in the convocation that we one of the monks said, so few people amongst humanity, amongst the population, actually put God first. And even Anandamoy, when he was speaking to the monastics and giving them a talk, he asked I think this was in Brother Sivananda's talk. He asked them, what's the most important priority for us monks? And everyone said, oh, to find God. And then he said, what else? And then monks were like, okay, seeking truth. And they started, and he's like, what else? What else? And he's like, no. He said, no to everyone. He's literally, no, the only thing, the only purpose we are here is to find God. There's no other purpose. Everything we're doing is just for that purpose. And as we say, there's very few people that would go all the way with that prescription, that requirement.
Nice. Yeah, I thought you were gonna quote the Bhagavad Gita with Krishna, right? He says, "Among 1,000 or one seeks me, and among 1,000 of those seekers, one finds me," or something. Right?
Yeah. The I think it may have been the same talk, Grant, that you were saying, which is that Jesus only had 12 disciples. Or there's the quote that I looked it up here just quickly when you were talking. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Seems to be sort of true, has been true for some time. So seems to be the constant.
Good. So back to the book. We love a segue here on the podcast. Yes. So then the saint says that he holds him with his tranquil eyes. And then Guruji says that he didn't actually realize that, what he just said was actually a veiled prophetic guidance. And we can clearly see that reading it with this knowledge in this moment. But it's amazing to me that, it wasn't until he sat down and was writing these words that he then had the light bulb moment of, right. Yeah.
The power of hindsight, especially when we're reflecting. Is a really important point is to reflect and a journal, because we may miss significant things that have happened because we didn't reflect. And this is a case in point here. Guruji didn't at that time know that this was a prophetic saying, but he did afterwards, maybe 30 years later. But he also, I like the fact that he, before this prophetic claim, he said that saint held me with his tranquil eyes. So it's almost like another one of those interiority moments that we talked about, because that precedes what happens next, which is the prophecy. So this tranquil eyes of, essentially a master looking at a disciple could have been less than a second, a glance, but I'm sure everyone would put their money on it being quite a prolonged gaze, as you can probably imagine. It was like a transmission, and such that Guruji this well remembers this conversation and this prophecy.
Yeah, exactly that. And then Mukunda sort of explains that he wish he'd write a book on yoga to benefit the whole world, and he tells him that he's basically training disciples. And I love this line. He says, "They and their line of students will serve as living volumes, proof against the natural disintegrations of time and the unnatural interpretations of the critics." I love this idea of serving as the living volume. It really made me introspect, actually, when I read this, and I thought, well, am I striving to serve as a living volume of truth? How well am I doing? Well, that's up for debate. But yeah, really, really lovely. Yeah, Priyank.
Yeah, judging a spiritual path or a saint by the disciples that are produced is a sure way of inspiring us, isn't it? Because you never know who's looking at you and how you're conducting yourself, because you're an ambassador, aren't you, for Guruji? Especially most importantly when you're at the center and you're serving or elsewhere, even on this podcast.
Yeah, I just noted it again. It's easy to overlook when he says India's teachings to America. He doesn't say, my teachings, Sri Tishvars. He doesn't actually attribute it to any one person or even group of people, or saints or gurus, is any lineage. He's talking about a broader sense, and he's got such love for India, and it's just one of those moments again where it just comes through really, really strongly there. It's not about him. It's not about the lineage. It's just about the nation's contribution to the great contribution to the world, that they'll bring the spiritual wealth, beyond the material wealth, and marry that up. It's just so subtly put in there, isn't it? It's very nice to note.
And he put an interesting spin on this as well, because just after that he put neither West nor East will flourish if yoga isn't practiced, essentially. And he put East in there as well. So even though he praised the rishis of old and India, he's saying that the East won't flourish either, which kind of insinuates that even in the East, it's amongst the masses, certainly it's not something that's practiced outwardly anyway. So it's a lesson even for all of those nations of the East, including India.
Yeah, and also going off from that, when he talked about disciplinary yoga being practiced, he doesn't just say yoga being practiced, it's disciplinary yoga, the art of self-discipline. Didn't quite pick up on that before. But yes, an instruction for sure. So after that, Priyank, yes?
Sorry, yeah.
That's
He also
okay.
said, I'm training disciples. I couldn't find, I did some research, I couldn't find any of his actual disciples. Listeners, if you do find any material for disciples of his that have perhaps written a book or whatever and dedicated it to Bhaduri Mahashaya, then please do know. Or maybe Mike, perhaps?
I read on Masvidal's website that he said that Bhaduri Mahashaya actually worked at a school and he was teaching Hatha Yoga there. So I was wondering if when he talked about his students, that he talked about them, or that he was sourcing his disciples from there, maybe.
Masvidal was one of our previous guests as well on the Awake series, and he was in the Awake film as well. Yeah, pretty cool.
There you go. Well, like Greg says, if any of you know, do let us know. So yes, the two then remain alone, and then the saint's disciples arrive later on in the evening, and he begins this discourse. There's like a peaceful flood. He swept away the mental debris of his listeners, floating them Godward. It really says a lot, doesn't it, when someone's speech can float us Godward. Guruji does that all the time with us. And it said that his speech was expressed in a flawless Bengali as well. So nice to know which language he was speaking in too.
Yeah.
Yeah, Priyank?
Yeah, it's really nicely worded, like a peaceful flood. He swept away the mental debris. So such a poignant visual, isn't it? Because we've all seen the images of flooding waters causing chaos, but this is the inverse.
Mm-hmm. And it's like when we're around people who have a higher level of consciousness and awareness, you do feel your own consciousness shifting and mental debris floating away. And I really introspected as well when I read this, and I was thinking, okay, well, is my speech like a peaceful flood? Does it, float away mental debris? Something to strive for. So yes, he then goes on to tell us that that evening he expounded various philosophical points connected with the life of Mirabai. I'd never heard of Mirabai before reading this, and I did some Googling, found many a story and many a recounting of who this person was. I'm mindful not to expound too much as truth because I wasn't there, so I do not know. But it was very interesting. She was basically a princess, and she was a devotee of Krishna. She loved him dearly with all her heart, and she eventually abandoned her life as princess and wife and devoted her whole life to God and wrote many songs in devotion to him. Priyank.
Yeah, principal method of worship was devotion, but like devotion to like unimaginable levels in terms of her actions and her poetry and dedication to spreading the joy. It's actually, Indians get pretty emotional when a Mirabai poem or even a story of Mirabai is related. It's so etched in everyone's hearts, similar to like Gandhi, but in a different way. But the art, and even like when she's painted and depicted in paintings, and listeners, I urge you to look at some Mirabai paintings with Krishna. They're just, even the artists are inspired in such a phenomenal way when they're drawing her. So even artwork depicting her are on quite a transcendental level. And also there's like film adaptations and Indian serial adaptations of her, and that's how loved she is even to this day.
And she's such a soul. Like, I would also urge people to read up about her and her life and the many stories that have come, because amazing, truly. I felt very, invigorated by her journey. So yeah, it goes on to say that this sannyasi, Sanata Goswami, refused to receive her because she was a woman. To which she replied, "Tell the master that I did not know there was any male in the universe save God. Are we not all females before him?" And apparently this reply brought him humbly to her feet. Wow. Yeah. And it says in brackets here, there's a scriptural conception of God being the only positive creative principle, and this creation is the passive maya.
Yeah, the Sanatan Goswami, just being referred to as one of the great sannyasis, that's true, but he's much more than that in terms of his influence on the bhakti or the devotional movement across India and worldwide, actually, because through his lineage, the ISKCON movement, for example, flourished. So he's very, very highly respected in that movement, and also other paths in India very much see him as one of the lineage for the devotional yoga movements. So he's really important, not just a sannyasi, but in terms of the influence of Hinduism and its development.
Which says a lot then, doesn't it, really, if he was brought humbly to her feet from her reply.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as we said before, it said that Mirabai has composed many songs, and Guruji actually translated one of them for us. So we're going to read it to you.
If by bathing daily God could be realized, sooner would I be a whale in the deep.
If by eating roots and fruits he could be known, gladly would I choose the form of a goat.
If the counting of rosaries would uncover him, I would say my prayers on mammoth beads.
If bowing before stone images unveiled him, a flinty mountain I would humbly worship.
If by drinking milk the Lord could be imbibed, many calves and children would know him.
If abandoning one's wife could summon God, would not thousands be eunuchs?
Mirabai knows that to find the Divine One, the only indispensable is love.
A necessary pause just to take that all in.
Which of these was it 7 or 8 sections do you most resonate with? Personally, I really like the one with the whale. I think it, and surprisingly, not surprisingly, Lauren made me read it as well. But I also like the fact that she's such an elevated soul that she's referring to herself in third person. So the last line is, Mirabai knows that to find the Divine One, the only indispensable is love. And we could say that of each of us. So Lauren knows, Brianne knows, Chris knows, Mike knows, but we have to attain to that, and that's the difficult thing. And that method of referring to yourself in third person is also used by Kabir in many of his poems. Like it ends with, exactly as Mirabai has done, ends with Kabir says, and he's actually saying it, so then he's referring to himself in third person. So it's this very artistic style of poetry where you're aloof from, you're kind of, you may be writing this, but actually it's like God writing it through you. So you're kind of narrating the writing of it, and you're just a pawn on the chessboard of God's master plan, which is really nice. And similar also later in the book, we've got Anandamoy Ma, who has a similar way of self-expression as well.
Yeah, I love how she describes all those different ways. If you could find God like this, and basically everything that's material in life is completely secondary for her, right? So she's, the one thing that she wants to know is God, and all those other experiences are completely, they're just a means to an end for her, but don't carry any value.
I love that she also says the only indispensable is love. I looked up indispensable because I love a dictionary definition, and it means we're getting some looks from Chris. It means absolutely necessary, and this was, I feel, the perfect word, because Guruji talks a lot about this, doesn't he? We cannot get to God, know God, unless we love Him truly. And we need the devotion. You may have all the technique in the world, but if you lack in your love, His heart will not be touched. So that last line is very powerful and also very instructive. We love a good lesson here in the Yogananda podcast. So Chris actually found excerpts from a talk by Brother Bhaktananda about love making us one with God. And I'm going to put you on the spot again, Chris. I wondered if you would just tell the listeners more about it, because I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, we were going to include it in the last episode, but I think given that he said it was going to be a short episode, it was maybe I think 90 minutes in before we even got to this section that this might have been relevant for. We skipped it, but there's a talk given on the subject of really kind of how to cultivate love for God. And when I was looking for these sort of topics, this came up. So Brother Bhaktananda said that the techniques are devotion, and techniques and devotion, are both necessary. Spiritual technique plus devotion is what will take us to God. So he goes on really to say that there's a story about how he was practicing for a long time, and he gone quite far in meditation, but then really couldn't seem to go beyond it. And Yogananda came and said to him that he lacked devotion, that he lacked love for God. And the point that he was making was that in addition to technique, you must also have love. And it just reminds me, actually, we talked about it before on the podcast. Sri Yukteswar told us about the heart and the maturity in the stages that the heart goes through. The dark heart, the propelled, the steady, the devoted, the clean. And it just reminds me, actually, when you were reading that poem on Mirabai, the stages of the heart, it's quite an elevated one to show this level of devotion that she's showing. And that's beyond the earlier stages, the dark, the propelled, the steady. So it's quite advanced. And so we must get to these stages. It seems there's an inevitability to be devoted. So the earlier we can cultivate it, I think the quicker then we'll excel in the path. So it's quite I suppose humbling in some way that maybe it's more of a Westerner's attitude where devotion is maybe lacking in some sense in the culture. It's more about the scientific advancements, things like that. But it's very humbling and beautiful to read. But there's Brother Bhaktananda sharing what is quite an intimate, quite a personal moment that he had with Yogananda. So anybody can find it if they look it up. We'll maybe share the link to it as well, so there's a fuller story behind it.
It often seems like that the techniques are more the scientific part, and the devotion is more like a hard to measure entity, right? I like the stages of the heart that you mentioned, Chris, because Sri Yukteswar described them in the Holy Science, right? The different stages of the heart. And I feel like what he was doing there is like creating a scientific scale for devotion and love for God, maybe, or love for everything around us. And there's certain connections you can draw, right? Like the highest state in the heart, you have this perfect love for God and you love everyone equally, right? And that reminds me of that story. I think it's in the autobiography and it's still to come, but just gonna mention it quickly, where Guruji says he had a strong love for his brother, right? And then Sri Yukteswar told him, you still love your brother more than everyone else. And that means you have to still go beyond that. And in that sense, there is a whole science of devotion as well that we kind of can develop, and there is certain milestones to achieve.
We talked at the top of the podcast about the yoga being watered down for the West, and I think this is probably a subject that it is watered down for the West, because if you went and told a typical person in the West maybe 100 years ago or today, hey, to get ahead, to find God, you have to love the homeless person on the street just as much as you love your mom, your brother, your sister, they would think you're mad. They would think you're crazy. I could never. It's almost like a betrayal of my own blood, in a sense. Blood is thicker than water. And it's that concept. So I think these concepts are maybe mind blowing to some of the more dogmatic ways of thinking, because it is advanced, and it does take a lot of work to get there. And yeah, old habits die hard, in a sense.
I was reminded, actually, when you were saying that, Chris, about the passage in the Bible where Jesus tells us to love thy neighbor as thyself. And that is essentially, in my understanding, what he is saying, love all. So actually, it's something that's been under our noses and taught for a long time. But in that really wide capacity, yeah, it's quite a feat, isn't it?
Yeah, the wide capacity is the principal point, because before that, Jesus said that. Before that, there was the commandment, thou shalt not kill. that essentially what that means is, you know, don't act on your instinct to harm people. You know, everyone's part of God, and that was a teaching that was suitable for that age. And then Christ came and he said, you know, love everyone equally, essentially. And now in this age, we've got the yoga principle, whereas you don't need to love everyone equally or practice that. You need to experience that they are you, you are them, and God is in you, and you are in God. So if that reality, that's like the highest reality, right? And that's the essentially the Kriya plus devotion part that we're aspiring to in this path of Guruji's. And Chris, it's really cool that you mentioned the 5 stages of the heart, because when you first mentioned it a few weeks ago, I'd read the Holy Science once, but you know, the scripture like that, you need to read it multiple times, because I didn't remember. I didn't when you were getting us to read it. I didn't even remember it, and now you've brought it up again here. And Mike has said that it's like he's trying to apply a scientific scale in a way, and then essentially then we can apply the litmus test onto our own lives and see where we fall on that scale, which is a really nice concept. And Brother Kamalananda, in his recent convocation talk, Guru, the messenger of God, also brought it up again in that talk as well.
Steady heart.
Yeah. Yes, which is cool.
I feel like that's some definite homework for us all, isn't it? If we have a copy of the Holy Science, delve in and apply the litmus test, as Priyank says. And if we don't have the book, I suppose we can still also introspect, you know, on our love and devotion. But that is the end of this section. Before we conclude, does anyone have anything they'd like to add or say?
Yes, a couple of small points that we didn't talk about because they were too minute. But seeing as we have a bit of time at the end of this, I'll mention them. Firstly, in part of it, he says that essentially that he's training disciples, and those disciples will serve as living volumes. And we talked about us, you know, how we're an example of the values of self-realization, fellowship, etc. And this is kind of saying that as well, that his students serve as living volumes. But then he also says proof against the natural disintegrations of time and unnatural. So there I got natural disintegrations. I kind of think the feeling came about everlasting youth, and how the Kriya path can bring that, you know, youthful energy throughout your life. And then also we're reminded of the prayer and energization, where we're kind of calling out for God as the eternal youth of body and mind abiding in us forever and forever, which was pretty cool. And in the last part of this section, that paragraph, he says the unnatural interpretations of critics, which is there are many skeptics of yoga, and there's many skeptics of also the different saints that are in the autobiography of a yogi, all the miracles that are there, and you can find those. But he's kind of in this paragraph, he's acknowledging that there will be skeptics and critics, but he's not like dismissing them. He's just saying that some things transcend essentially reason and logic and physical science experimentation, because there's astral and causal energies at play which are not detectable by ordinary physical senses and other things like that.
You know, whenever I think about this subject, my mind always goes back to the story that I heard about the chap at the time, maybe in I think the 18th or 19th century, that was running in Switzerland the you know, when you get copyright patent, he was running the patent office, the head patent office, and he said, look, we can close it down now. Everything is going to be invented. It's being invented. It's that mentality, isn't it? That seems so obvious to me to say we're at the infancy. We're going to go on a journey of discovery, and that there are beings like Guruji, like Shirkteshwar and Mihir Masha and others, Babaji, that have pierced through the veil of this reality beyond the needs of using scientific tools and things like that. So, just we've talked about it before, science and maybe religion or the idea of spirituality coming full circle one day. Not anytime soon, but one day.
Well, there was a recent breakthrough in free energy, wasn't there? Where they, for the first time, they kind of unwrapped that thesis where you can't get more than you put in. They actually they did some experiments, and they found was it in CERN, Mike? Where was it? That they actually did an experiment where they got more energy out than they put in, and obviously it was a very groundbreaking result. But it's coming. It's coming. We're on the threshold.
That's really interesting. I never heard of that before. Will you maybe put a link or something? People can.
I heard of the fusion experiments that they made,
That's the one. Yeah.
And it was actually at Lawrence Livermore Institute here in California. Of course,
not CERN.
And even though they spend a lot more money on this in Europe, they found out about it here. And it was at the time I was doing an internship in Livermore at that same time. So I was like, I'm in the right place. No, I don't think I'm involved. I was a contributing factor to this. But it was interesting because they said they have those really long timelines with the fusion reactors, and this was like much earlier than they expected it to happen. So great, but I don't think it's contradicting to to any physical laws that we currently have. We kind of always knew that this was possible. We just didn't manage to pull it off yet.
And Mike, you say that you didn't have any influence, but your mere presence, I think, probably helped. Do you think, when you read this prophetic guidance, where essentially Guruji's hearing that he will one day be going to the West or America, when you first read this, now in hindsight, do you think you are also in this category, seeing as you've also landed and now settled in California, in the far west?
No, I don't liken myself to Yogananda.
No, but you're there. You're right there. You're a stone's throw away from the most holiest places on earth.
If he wouldn't have gone, I wouldn't have gone, right? So it's more like that.
He did go, and he wrote the Autobiography of Yogi, and you read it all those years ago. Yeah,
and he created those amazing centers here in California, and they make California a special place in the world, I think.
Definitely.
Has everyone here been to Mother Center yet? No, Chris, no. Priyank has. Mike, I'm guessing you have. No?
Yeah,
you have.
I think Priyank must have as well.
Yeah, just me and Chris.
Mike, you're part of the furniture nowadays, aren't you? We can't get you out.
Mother Center. Oh, in California. Oh yeah. No, I'm definitely found my home here. Yeah, and there's a standing invitation to you guys if you want to ever come by.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Mike's always in Lake Shrine. He's always checking in, and he's just there 20
I live near there. Yeah, it's a great place.
Well, if no one else has anything other to add, thank you so much for today, and thank you, listeners, for joining us.
It was a short one, Lauren. Well done.
It was.
You cracked the whip, and you cracked it well.
I like efficiency.
Yeah.
But yes, join us again next week for the rest of the chapter. Very exciting. Led by the lovely Mike. And we'll meet all again next week.
Take care.